great to be here tonight at my alma mater, Virginia Commonwealth University. I'm Richard Foster, the host of a new true crime podcast, Southern Nightmare, The Hunt for the South Side Strangler. The podcast is coming out on May 30th, but it's my pleasure to announce that if you haven't figured it out, you can now subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. I'll wait. So I'd like to welcome all of you and thank you for coming out to the special live sneak preview of Southern Nightmare. I understand we also have Jackson Brown in town tonight, and we're also competing with Congressman Dave Bratt, so I think you make a better choice. Now, the video trailer you just watched is the work of Charlotte Woods. Charlotte's with us filming tonight. She is a VCU graduate student. She's going to be graduating next week with a master's degree in multimedia journalism. Let's give Charlotte later in the evening, we are going to be showing, for the first time anywhere, 6 minutes, an extended trailer of the podcast. So you guys will get the first good listen of it. As you probably noticed, I'm going old school tonight. I've got the paper script like an old-time radio announcer. We're recording tonight's show. Some of this might end up as bonus content for the podcast, so follow us on social media, and I'll be posting about that in the near future. Okay, so to get this out of the way, I'd like to thank our sponsors for this evening. Support for this event comes from PEN America's Press Freedom Incentive Fund, a resource for mobilizing communities around information access, media truth, news literacy, and other issues related to press freedom advocacy. I also want to thank VCU Student Media Center for securing this wonderful space for us tonight. And finally, I want to give a thank you. And finally, I want to give a great big Southern thank y'all to my two partners in this podcast, Style Weekly Magazine, and WRIR 97.3 FM Richmond. My podcast is going to be accompanied by a series of articles that are going to be running in Style every week from May 30th through August 1st. So there'll be some complimentary content in Style every single week. If you listen to the podcast, you'll get a little more in Style. And Southern Nightmare, you'll also be able to hear it locally here on WRIR. I began working on this podcast in fall 2017. Let's see if I can take this with me. Just glue this. So I began working on this podcast probably last October, and I'm really excited to be able to finally share this with you. It's been a long, long journey. I have interviewed more than 40 people for this project. I have interviewed retired law enforcement, homicide detectives, like Ray, who's with us tonight. I have interviewed former prosecutors, defense attorneys, friends and family of victims, and they've all been extremely kind with their time, and I appreciate that so very much. Page 3. Some of them are here with us tonight, like I mentioned. In just a little bit, we'll be talking with them about their connections to this case. But first, 30 years later, why am I doing this podcast? For those of you who don't know me, I'm a Richmond native. I've been writing professionally for local newspapers and magazines here for more than 25 years. My first published article was a 1992 interview with Marvel Comics creator Stan Lee, and that was published in the Richmond News Leader. I was, I think, 21 years old, and it was in the Richmond News Leader, which is the city's now defunct old afternoon paper. From 1997 to 1999, I was a full-time staff writer at Style Weekly. And I covered things there like unsolved murders and a lot of politics, including a brand new city councilman at the time, Tim Kaine. Anybody heard of that guy? I don't know what happened. So not long after I started working at Style, I found out from some of my coworkers that one of the South Side Strangler's victims, Debbie Davis, had also worked at Style. Her murder had happened 10 years prior, and there were still several people there at the time who had worked with Debbie and had been her friends. When Debbie was killed, I was 16. At the time, I knew there was a serial killer called the South Side Strangler who was on the loose in the city. I lived out in the suburbs, so I don't think it made as big an impression on me. I mean, I'll be honest, I was 16, I was not glued to the newspapers at the time. But I do remember how scared people were. Even out in Henrico County, I can remember my stepmom and my sister sleeping with the lights on when my dad had to work late, so I can remember that. My main memory from that time is I was visiting a friend at her apartment, her sister's apartment, in Chesterfield County, and she lived just down the road from where the Strangler, like a week before, had just killed a 15-year-old girl, Diane Show. And my friend's sister was, obsessively making sure we kept doors and windows shut. And after I left, I remember walking to my car and being really nervous, looking around the parking lot. And I'm thinking now back on that, like, I would be able to tell who the serial killer was. But, I guess I thought I would be able to tell. So last year, I began talking with Style about doing a project about the South Side Strangler killings. Debbie Davis was one of our own, and we felt that we owed this to her. So we realized that we were in the midst of the 30th anniversary of the case. Many of the key players are now in their 60s and 70s. Some have passed away. We realized this was probably our last chance to tell the story. The more I dug into this, the more I realized that this is not only an epic true crime tale, it's probably one of the most important chapters in the history of the modern American criminal justice system. And chances are good you've never even heard about it. This case marked the first time in U.S. history that a murderer was brought to justice using DNA evidence. And that murderer just so happened to be a serial killer. And he also just so happened to be killing right here in Richmond, Virginia. Let's not apply for that. Well, that set the stage for how police use DNA to catch killers today. In fact, just last week, police in California, you may have heard, used DNA to make an arrest in the serial killing case that dates back to the 1970s and 1980s. And that killer had an MO that was scarily similar to the South Side Strangler. Does anyone follow the news? Can anyone tell me the name of that serial killer? Golden State. Golden State Killer? Yeah. All right. All right, you're our first winner of the evening. Medium or large? Medium or large? Large. Large? Okay, let's see what we got. Here you go, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, we got a few more of these to give away tonight. All right, you know your true crime. All right, so back to the DNA. It is really hard to understate how big a deal, how groundbreaking the South Side Strangler case was back in 1988. Today, we all know about DNA. This was way before O.J. Simpson. This is way before TV shows like CSI or Law and Order, where we all got the idea that DNA matches killer to crime. This was even years before Jurassic Park. And that's not just the Spielberg movie, also the Michael Crichton book. People did not know what DNA was. Up until the South Side Strangler case, dusting for fingerprints and comparing blood types were still the best ways to link a criminal to a crime scene. Police in the 1980s were still using the same cutting-edge technology that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was writing about in his Sherlock Holmes stories back in the 1890s. So let that sink in. With modern forensic science, it is now easier to identify and capture violent criminals, sometimes, hopefully, before they escalate to murder. And that brings us to our first guest tonight. Debbie Smith is the founder of HEART, Hope Exists After Rape Trauma, a nonprofit organization that advocates for and supports victims of rape and sexual assault. Debbie herself is a rape survivor. In March 1989, Debbie was abducted from her kitchen and raped by a masked intruder while her husband Rob, a police officer, was sleeping upstairs in their bedroom. Debbie's attacker was brought to justice because of the DNA crime databases that were created as a direct result of the South Side Strangler case. In 2004, Congress passed the Debbie Smith Act, which strengthened the federal law enforcement DNA database and provided funding to reduce the backlog of untested DNA evidence. That act was reauthorized in 2008 and 2014. Please help me welcome Debbie Smith. and for everything you do for survivors of rape and sexual assault. First, first, if you wouldn't mind, can you please tell us about what happened to you back in March 1989?
Sure. I was a stay-at-home mom, and as you said, my husband worked for the Williamsburg Police Department, and he had been up for over 36 hours when he hit the bed that night because he had worked a midnight shift. He'd gone to court. He was working on his a degree, his bachelor's degree. So it had been about 36 hours, so he wouldn't have heard anything. But I was trying to clean house and get my laundry done, and I was preparing dessert for dinner with friends that evening. And in the midst of everything, my clothes dryer didn't seem to be working properly, so I went out a back door. As a police officer's wife, I knew you leave your doors locked. But I thought, I'll just leave it unlocked for a few minutes when I came back in from checking the exhaust vent, because I thought I will grab the trash and just come right back out. But before I could come back out, within less than 5 minutes, a masked stranger came in that door, forcibly took me out of my home to the woods behind my house, where he robbed and repeatedly raped me. I will never, ever forget words that he said to me as he let me go, as he let me return from those woods. He said to me, he said, "Lady, you keep listening to that Christian radio." And I said, "Okay." And I really thought that he was going to shoot me because he said that he had a gun. I never saw the gun because I was blindfolded. And then as I walked further, he said, "And lady," I said, "What?" And he said, "Locking doors." Those words sent chills up my spine, and they do to this day. Through the entire time that he had me, he kept telling me, if you don't know anything about Williamsburg, Williamsburg is a city of about 10 square miles. So everybody knows everybody, and everybody knows what everybody's doing and where everybody is. It was a small community at that time. And he said to me, "You remember, I know where you live, and I will come back to kill you and your family, or your family, if you tell anyone." But I did tell someone. As soon as I was allowed to leave those woods, I ran upstairs, and I woke my husband with the only words I could get out of my mouth. And all I could say was, "He got me, Rob, he got me." His first instinct was to call the police, and I begged him not to, because I didn't want to get anybody else involved with this, because I feared that this man really would come back and kill me, or worse, he may grab one of my children. My children were 12 and 13 at the time. But I'm thankful that my husband looked past my tears. He looked past my cries, and he said, "Honey, you've got to go to the hospital. We need to talk to the police, and then you need to go to the hospital and allow them to take the rape kit." And I just couldn't even imagine going through something like that after just having been raped by this man. But he helped me to do what he knew that I couldn't do on my own that day. And I will be forever grateful to him for helping me to do that. He refused to let my tears keep him from helping me to make those hard decisions, because it was that evidence that day that found him.
So let's talk a little more about that. Do you know?
I'm okay.
Okay. At first, they thought that, because this is March 1989, or March 1988, sorry. 1989. So there was a little concern that maybe this might have been South Side Strangler.
Yes.
That maybe they'd gotten the wrong guidelines.
Exactly.
But that quickly became apparent that wasn't the case. It took years for you to heal. And you knew this guy was still out there. I'm sure you mentioned, I mean, this had to be pretty terrifying, wondering could he come back and where you lived, could he even hurt your kids, could hurt your husband.
Absolutely. One of the things when a trauma like this happens is that you're robbed of the innocence of thinking that this can't happen to me, that it's always somebody else. So when you're robbed of that type of innocence, now you know that you're vulnerable for it. So you begin to think that you're vulnerable everywhere, all the time, and you never feel safe. I think for me, fear was probably the most invasive feeling that I had. When it happens as an introvert, I was always comfortable in my home. I always felt safe in my home. I always felt free to be who I was in my home. And now this had been taken from me. I also worried constantly about my children. Where were they? I had to know where they were at every moment because I was so afraid that this had become a very public case, being a police officer's wife in a small town. And so I knew that if he was looking at any of the newspapers, that he would know that I told. And I know that he had been through my children's books and things, so I was afraid that he would know how to get to them. I worried about my husband being a police officer on the street, that he would try to get to him. So it was that constant fear of him coming back and him trying to take our life. But for me, worse than taking my life would have been for him to take one of my children. It's a paralyzing feeling. It just totally cripples you. And it's invasive. Fear will just kind of take over every part of your life. It permeates throughout to where you end up just where it's not even worth getting up in the morning because you're wondering, is he out there? Where is he? What's he doing? And the worst part of it was I thought about him 24/7, and maybe he probably never gave me a second thought.
He was caught. Let's talk about that. How did you find out that he had been caught?
Well, I found out through the police department, actually, on July the 26th of 1995, Williamsburg Police Department received a call that there had been a cold hit on my case. In fact, I was the 4th cold hit in our country. So the lab called the police department. The police department got in touch with the supervisor that was on duty that day so that he could deliver the news. That supervisor happened to be my husband. Thank you very much. His supervisor told him Rob says that my husband said that he just kind of leaned in the car and he said, "We got him." And my husband he wanted to call me, and at that time phones were like yay big, and they were only for official use. And he said, "Go ahead, you can call her." He said, "No, I need to deliver this message in person." And my husband said that he probably looked really strange. He was crying and driving a police cruiser down the road. But he walked into the house, and I happened to be sitting in a chair putting my shoes on. And he handed me the composite that we had drawn the day after I was raped. And he handed it to me, and he said, "You can throw this away because we don't need it anymore." It was the first time in 6.5 years that I took a deliberate breath. I wanted to live because during those 6.5 years I became very suicidal. I didn't want to live. In fact, I thought that him leaving me alive was part of the cruel punishment because now I had to live with this every day. I had to remember every detail every day. And for me, I felt like it would have been much more, it would have shown at least a little compassion to have just taken my life.
I think I speak for your husband, your family, and everybody else here. We're glad you did.
Well, I am too now.
There was one man who was instrumental in setting up not only the DNA database for Virginia, but setting up the whole idea of DNA databases across our nation. Virginia's DNA database was the first in the nation, and it was established by the late Dr. Paul Ferrara, who was director of the Virginia Department of Forensic Science. That's Dr. Ferrara right there.
Yes, it is.
Can you tell me about the role that Dr. Ferrara played in your life and how his work has led to solving literally hundreds of thousands of criminal cases like yours over the last 30 years?
I sure can. I will never forget my first introduction to Paul was at my trial. He had come to listen to see how his scientists would explain DNA science to jurors, to laymen. He had worked very hard to make sure that they could take what could be a very complicated science, and he wanted them to be able to make the average juror understand that science. So he was there the day that I testified, and he listened to his scientists testify. And after the trial was over, we got a phone call from my husband's police department where Paul Ferrara was wanting to talk with us. And from that phone call, I found out that Dr. Paul Ferrara was on Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General of the United States at that time. She had got together a commission and started a commission on the future of DNA evidence. And this commission was set up just to figure out what about this science of DNA. Should we go forth with the data bank? And Paul thought it would be a good idea if they could find a victim who had benefited from DNA to come and speak to that commission. So he called, he got the information, we talked, and I told them, no, there's no way I can do this. You don't understand who I don't even order a hamburger from McDonald's. I cannot go and talk to a panel of people that, Barry Scheck was on the panel. There were chief justices on the panel. There were, all kinds of very important people on this panel, and I just said, I can't do it. And I finally agreed to go because, again, my husband helped me to make those hard decisions. So I finally agreed to go, and after I spoke, Paul asked me if I would come and visit the lab. I said, sure. So I came and I got a nice tour of the lab, and then he said, would you help me get this law passed? And I told him, I said, I can't do that. I said, you don't know what you're asking. So he took me into a room, and I will never forget it, where from floor to ceiling, there was row after row of shelves. And there were all kind of boxes and bags and baskets of stuff. And I said, what is this? He said, these are rape kits that have never been tested. And so I said, what can I do? And so we ended up, he was very instrumental. He was relentless on trying to make sure that this law got passed. He was trying to make sure that people understood how important DNA is. My whole case was about, is DNA junk science? And Paul made sure that his scientists knew how to explain to the average Joe on the street exactly what DNA does and what it can do. I believe that, and I know that anything that I accomplish in this life is because of Paul Ferrara and his encouragement The things that I thought that I could not do, between him and my husband, they said, you can do it. Even today, there's a consortium of scientists who try to convince me that this money that I work for to go out to the different state labs across our country to test these rape kits, they would rather do something else with this money. And it was Paul who kept telling me, you keep fighting this fight. And I saw him just about 3 months before he died, and one of the last things he said was, you keep fighting for this money, because DNA is worth this money.
And at that point, I'm going to mention, I think we lost Dr. Ferrara, was it 2009, I believe?
Yeah.
2009. Yeah, something like that, 8 or 9. I had known him also. Dr. Ferrara, again, let's not understate this. He created the nation's first criminal data database, first DNA database, right here in Virginia. He also championed the creation of the nation's DNA databanks. As of February 2018, the National DNA Database, CODIS, has produced more than 410,000 hits, assisting in more than 395,000 criminal investigations across the nation. We're going to hear more about Dr. Ferrara and Virginia's groundbreaking role in DNA crime fighting in future episodes of Southern Nightmare. Debbie, thank you very much again for being here tonight. Donate to Debbie's organization. We have some issues with Mike. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Donate to Debbie's organization or learn more about it. Search on Google for Heart. Hope Exists After Rape Trauma. It's heart.org, but if you go to heart.org, you're going to get the American Heart Association. It's heart with dashes in the middle. So H-E-. But definitely worth a great charity and well worth your donations. All right. You may have noticed tonight, I'm not referring to the South Side Strangler's real name. This podcast is going to be a little different, and I think this may have demonstrated that to you. This is not your typical true crime podcast. For one thing, this isn't a cold case. We know the outcome. You can go on Wikipedia right now and look up the basic facts of the case, but I guarantee you that is not the whole story. You will not hear Debbie's case on Wikipedia. I'll be telling the story of the South Side Strangler in a narrative fashion, kind of like Serial or S-Town. In this podcast, you will not hear the killer's name until the point in the story when the detectives knew it. Another reason I'm not saying his name is that pop culture often glorifies serial killers. It makes them into celebrities instead of the monsters they really are. Their victims are reduced to objects like Mr. Body and Clue. But the South Side Strangler attacked and killed real people. There are still friends and family members of these people walking around with pain of losing their loved ones. And more importantly, there are 5 people who can't be with us tonight and who need us to tell their stories and remember them. Carolyn Hom was a 32-year-old Washington, D.C. lawyer. She liked playing squash. She was preparing for a vacation in Peru. She would be 66 years old today. Debbie Davis worked with my friends at Style. She loved mystery novels and Bruce Springsteen records. She would have celebrated her 66th birthday this summer. Dr. Susan Helms was a promising 32-year-old neurosurgery resident right here at the Medical College of Virginia at VCU. She adored Paris. She would be 63 today. Diane Cho was a 15-year-old immigrant from South Korea. She was a good student, but she was also going through a little bit of a teen rebellion. She liked to argue with her little brother, she would sneak cigarettes, and she was dating a boy behind her parents' backs. She would be 45 now. Sue Tucker was a magazine editor. She was getting ready to quit her job to move to Wales with her husband, Reg. She would be 74 today. My next guest studied at the FBI's renowned behavioral science unit in Quantico, Virginia, learning about serial killers from the nation's top experts in the field. He worked the Colonial Parkway serial killing case, and he assisted in the South Side Strangler investigation. These days, he is retired and battling ALS as hard as he fought criminals. It's a little tough for him to speak, so we're just going to have a quick chat. Please give a warm welcome to a retired profiler and senior special agent from the Violent Crimes Unit of the Virginia State Police, Larry McCann. Walking sticks, I'm sorry. I should know better. I stand corrected. Okay. Let's see. Make sure the mic good. Okay. Larry, thank you for being here. Here we go. John's going to help me. We're not going to give away the details tonight of how it happened. You'll have to listen a little bit later in the podcast to find this out. But you are one of the people who came face to face with the South Side Strangler, and you spent some time with him. Can you tell me what you remember from meeting him? What sort of an impression did he make on you?
Well, unlike Ray here, I wasn't part of the initial investigation that brought him down. I was just on the edges of that. But when he was on death row in Virginia, I went to see him. In Dante's Inferno, as you go through the gate to hell, there's a sign, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." And if you want to find out the truth from a violent offender, the best time to talk to him is when he's abandoned all hope. So for a year, an FBI agent and I looked into his life, his victims, the way he worked, and we went to him a week before his execution. The first thing I noticed was his fingers. When I shook his hand, he had the longest fingers I had ever seen. And I had to think at that moment, how many necks had those fingers been around? And I said, first thing after we shook hands, told him who we were, I said, "You're gonna die in 1 week, and you know it. The governor will not intervene. The Supreme Court has had enough of you. We're not here to get any more cases solved or confessions. We just want to know how you did it, why you did it, so that we can help the next guy that's coming down the road, so that we can stop it sooner. So there aren't 5 or 10 victims, so we can stop that guy after one." And after a year of coming up with strategies, trying them on people, fine-tuning it, we got nothing from the guy. All he would say, time and again, was, "Yeah, but I didn't hurt anybody." Kind of like John Wayne Gacy. 33 bodies were found in the crawl space under John Wayne Gacy's house in California, in Chicago. I was talking with Gacy and said, hey, tell me about all those kids you buried in your crawl space. He said, now, anybody could have done that. Anybody could have snuck up under my house and buried a kid.
As one does.
Yeah. Ray, got any in your basement?
That's weird, I filled it up, thank you.
Yeah. You know, I said, okay, I'll give you one, but I'm not giving you 33.
I think that math adds up. I think, yeah.
So he was unhelpful also. Just like the South Side Strangler, he was not at all helpful. He didn't want to help us cut off this nonsense sooner. And I was surprised about that. He was quiet, deferential. He didn't look like a monster. You wouldn't pick him out of a crowd. But we have had success with others. And I was really hoping we would have success with this film, but it didn't happen.
How did the South Side Stranglers' MO fit the profile of serial killers? What sort of things do serial killers like him have in common?
Well, one thing we noticed is that he was attacking the victims inside their residence. And so Ray started looking for a burglar because they escalate. And sure enough, he had escalated from burglary to sexual assault to murder. In our research, we found a few dozen sexual assaults that he had committed, which means he may have committed 200 as a low number, because just as, where's Debbie?
Oh, she left. They had to go. They had some friends visiting.
Just as she said, she didn't want to report, and so many of the victims do not report. So I look at 10 times the number that we find reported against one person as a ballpark number.
That's pretty staggering.
So he escalated all along the line. Once we had a handle on who he was, we were able to look back and see that escalation.
That pattern.
Well, one of the problems we had, though, is that statistically, Caucasians kill Caucasians, and African-Americans kill African-Americans. So we were looking for a white serial killer. The study of serial offenses was rather new at the time when this series was going on. If you look back exactly 100 years previous, you would see Jack the Ripper as the prototypical serial killer. And up until this time, we had only seen white male serial killers. Well, this guy wasn't a white male, and now we have female serial killers also.
Anything else you might want to add? I think you've given us a lot.
I'm about out of words.
In just a few minutes, we'll be speaking with retired Richmond Police Homicide Detective Ray Williams and Style Weekly Magazine founder Lauren Wyckoff. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about what went into making this podcast. You've heard the phrase, it takes a village. I could not have done this without the help of a lot of people, mainly Richmonders, who helped me get this to the finish line. When I first started this project, I called up Gary Harkey. He's an investigative reporter at the Virginian Pilot newspaper in Norfolk to get some advice. Gary and another reporter, Joanne Kimberlin, co-hosted an excellent podcast called The Shot about an unsolved murder of a Virginia Beach policeman. If you haven't heard that, I highly recommend it. I will never forget what Gary said to me when I was asking him about what it would take to do a podcast. He said, wait, you've got a full-time job and you're going to do this all by yourself? You realize it took me and another reporter 6 whole months and that's all we did. So podcasting, Gary assured me, is a time suck. No matter how much time you estimate it'll take, you can pretty much double or triple it, and he was right about that. I think my wife can attest over here that we used to have this thing called spare time. I kind of remember that once upon a time. This thing fills up all of our nights, weekends, and every other minute we have. I'm hoping I might be able to catch up to all the movies I've missed sometime by next year. I heard the new Avengers movie has a really great happy ending, but don't spoil it for me. As I've worked on this podcast, I've also had to learn entirely new ways of reporting and storytelling. I went to WRIR. I learned how to use a portable Zoom recorder and microphones to conduct interviews. I usually record interviews for the articles I write for magazines, but I do it with my phone. I don't have to worry about sound quality. I don't have to worry about accidentally talking over people. But with podcasts, I found out there are a million challenges to recording out in the field. The world is not a soundproof booth. There are a lot of challenges to recording that I had never considered. People have dogs that bark, air conditioners that sound like roaring highways, computers and phones that beep at exactly the wrong times. I had to find ways to compensate. Sometimes I had to ask people to repeat what they said to me, ask them to turn off that TV in the background. When I've had to do phone interviews, I've actually learned that standing in a clothes closet full of clothes is a really good cheap substitute for a recording studio with soundproof foam on the walls. Works like a charm. Another issue is tracking down sources. Fortunately, this is something I had a little bit of experience with. My claim to fame before this was that when I was a student here at VCU in my early 20s, I became the first journalist to contact the reclusive 1950s pinup icon Betty Page. I ended up writing a biography of her that was adapted into the 2005 HBO movie, The Notorious Betty Page. Have you seen that? My screen credit is all the way at the very end. and I think, just between all of us, I think that's because they forgot they were contractually obligated to put it in. Because the last thing they did on that film. As part of writing that book, I had to track down people who had scattered all over the country and whose last known addresses were 40 or 50 years old. That was before the internet, so I had to do a lot of library research. I had to look up old city directories, old news articles. So having the internet makes it a little easier to find people this time around, but the biggest problem I found is that people don't have landlines anymore. Cell phone numbers aren't listed with directory assistance generally, so I had to do a lot of internet searching by social media, newspaper articles, online databases. And sometimes it just came down to asking people, hey, do you know so-and-so? Larry, for instance, was incredibly generous, and he called up an FBI profiler I've been trying to reach and asked him to talk to me. And I sat at Larry's kitchen table for about 40 minutes doing that interview, and greatly appreciated that. Thank you. That brings me to probably the most important part of reporting the story. More than sound quality or even the research, I had to build a rapport with the people I interviewed. A lot of the people I talked with for this story are in their 60s and 70s. A lot of them aren't that familiar with podcasting, so I had to explain that a little. I'd pull out my phone and play a podcast a little bit. This is what I'm doing. I also had to earn their trust. 17 years ago, a close friend of mine was killed. She was murdered in her bed while she slept. I had already been a reporter for about 10 years at that point. I had covered a lot of crimes, a lot of murders. I will say it opened my eyes because I did not know at that point, I had no idea what it felt like to have someone you know be murdered. It is like unlike any death. I mean, we have car accidents, we have illness, those are unfortunate, those are awful, but we know those happen. This is like a horror that it feels like all the rules of society have been broken. Everything that we feel is safe and good and right and the way things should be are completely violated. So I think that gives me a little bit of perspective into what some of the people that I've been talking to for this project are feeling. And I don't pretend to feel the depth of pain and loss that they have felt. But you carry that pain and that knowledge with you. So I've tried my best to let the people that I've talked to for the story know that I would honor their loved ones and be empathetic. This was the biggest news story in Richmond 30 years ago. It made national headlines. I mean, there are stories in the Washington Post, the New York Times from back then, Reader's Digest. Reporters back then were in a rush to make deadlines. They didn't dig as deeply as they could sometimes, but they also didn't have access to all the information and the details and the court records that I do today. Some victims had more written about them than others. For instance, Richmonders found out a lot about Dr. Helms, the neurosurgeon here from DCU, but by comparison, very, very little was written about Diane Cho. She was essentially summed up as a 15-year-old, good student, Asian, high school freshman. There was a book written about the South Side Strangler case in 1995, a very good book, but even that didn't have very much information about who Diane was as a person. When I started reaching out to Diane's family for this podcast, I found out their frustration with the news coverage back then was that reporters had not used a translator to talk to them. Diane's family immigrated from South Korea about 2 years before her murder. Her parents were poor, they ran a convenience store in South Richmond, they spoke very little English. Her 12-year-old brother's English was only a little bit better. Reporters talked to her father through her brother. And at the time, her brother wasn't able to articulate in English what his father had been feeling and saying. So in order to interview Diane's mother, who had never really been interviewed before, I worked to find a native Korean court-certified translator. It took weeks, but making that effort built the trust up with her mother and her brother. And now, for the first time, I can tell Diane's story in a way that has never been done before, because I took the time to build that trust and build a rapport with her family and friends. And that was very much worth it. Okay, so now it's time in our program to welcome our final two guests of the evening. Ray Williams is a retired Richmond police homicide detective who worked the South Side Strangler case and also helped apprehend the notorious Briley brothers. Everybody remembers that case. Lorna Wyckoff is the founder and former publisher of Style Weekly magazine. Style's first issue was laid out on Lorna's kitchen table in 1982. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Ray and Lorna. Oh, sure. I didn't mean you. No. So I'm going to start with Ray. Ray, right before these killings started, you had a pretty remarkable opportunity that prepared you for what was going to happen. You were one of 50 detectives who were chosen for a special honor. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, we were one detective per state was chosen to attend the behavioral science unit from the Quantico, and I attended the class for 14 months. And we had some of the actual detectives that worked with the John Wayne Gacy case, and a bunch of them. Well, I was not that familiar with the serial killers, but that was a great school. We stayed up there during the week and came home on weekends. And 2 weekends after I finished the course is when his first murder happened.
So he spent 14 months studying about serial killers. 2 weeks later, first serial killer in his career. And if any of you have watched the Netflix series Mindhunter, anybody familiar with that one? Johnny Depp, yeah. Ray, Larry, they interacted with those guys, and also, you know, all the case files they mentioned, like Edmund Kemper and those folks, you guys studied those.
And once you go through a class like that, you remember every detail. I mean, Gacy was, and just, he got buried all the kids underneath his crawl space. He got pictures taken with Rosalynn Carter during the political campaign. He was a clown. So, you know, you could be walking down the street, you don't even know what a serial killer is.
But I think clown is a good indication. I think that's a safe one. All right, so Ray, well, let's talk, Lorna, at the time of the murders, Debbie Davis had been working as your accounts manager at Style for 2 years. So tell us a little bit about Debbie. What do you remember about Debbie? There's Debbie right there.
Debbie was wonderful. Everybody loved Debbie. Debbie was the kind of employee who was just dedicated and happy and loved her friends and had bowls of candy on her desk. If there was going to be a Christmas party or a tree or this or that, you'd go to Debbie and she'd be sort of the person who would take care of that. I loved working with her. One of the things that she did for us was collect our accounts. And you know, we were young, we didn't really know what we were doing, so it was very easy for people not to pay their bills. And you know, if anybody's ever done that, collecting bills from restaurateurs is not the easiest thing. And some of us were known to walk into places and pick up cash registers, computers, and walk out and attempt to get paid. But Debbie loved calling these people in the sweetest way and collecting money and working out credit plans, and would come up deliriously happy that she had all these various successes. And so we started talking about paying her commission and some of things. But she could take the most mundane thing and make it a wonderful thing. So she was loved, I would say. She was loved.
And now, an interesting fact, Lorna and Ray worked very closely together following the murder. I believe this is the case. The two of you have not seen each other in 30 years. Tonight is the first time, I believe, in 30 years the two of them have seen each other.
We have not, although I did see you in some nightmares that I was
I'm sorry, nightmare.
Yeah, so Lorna, when you first met Ray, tell us about the way you met Ray.
Saturday morning in September, and we lived on Monument Avenue. My husband and I and our 2 young daughters, and the doorbell rang, and 2 men in suits standing out there, and walked in the door and just told us, did Dudley Davis work for us? Yes. And then sort of announced, I think we were talking, I think I fainted or nearly fainted or something, pretty close to that. And it was very clear and obvious at the outset that this appeared to be something that might have been about this scrappy young paper that sometimes said bad things about people. And you know, we would have reviewers who would write prose like how the coffee taste, my favorite was the coffee tasted like someone had poured it through a sneaker. And then 2 days later, the restaurant owner would be on our doorstep. So it
was before Starbucks. Just so.
Yeah, and it wasn't unusual that we could write something that irritated someone, although we certainly never intended to, and never wrote of anything that we thought would be consequential. So when Ray and his partner were investigating, the first thing was to go down to the Style offices and rifle through everything. And then there was a lot of investigation about what we wrote and who said what, and I understand that it was sort of thought that it was intended for me for a while. So
yeah, let's go ahead and switch to that. Yeah, right. So initially, you guys were thinking that Debbie's murder might have been a case of mistaken identity.
Yeah, because one thing for a homicide investigation, you got to find out everything about the victim, and then tap things into. Well, we couldn't really develop anything that other than she lived alone and the information that Lorna gave us. But it was tough when I first walked into the scene too. We knew we had a special case.
Let's talk about that. So you were downtown, I think at 7th and Main, 8th and Main when you got the call that Saturday, or it was Saturday morning when you got the call. And you went to Debbie Davis's apartment, and she lived at the time right off of Forest Hill Avenue.
4527 Shadow Road, Apartment 2.
That is the memory of the homicide detective. That's pretty impressive. And what did you find when you got into her apartment?
When I got there, the uniform officers are trained to secure the scene and then don't touch anything back there. The uniform officer had gone to the next door neighbor, got a key from her, and walked in. He walked down to the bedroom, the living room on the left, short hallway, bathroom on the right, and hers was the bedroom on the left at the end of the hallway. And, I'm sorry.
And then you found that they saw the body.
Yes, I saw the body laying across the bed, head hanging off, with hands tied behind her back, and two socks tied around her neck with a 15-inch extension pipe from the vacuum cleaner, and it turned and twisted.
It had been used like a tourniquet.
That's exactly what it was. And we found it from the medical exam, which each victim, he was taking 2 to 3 hours to kill.
And Ray, what are we looking at here?
This is a kitchen window to Debbie's apartment. Below that, 6 foot below, was he had stolen a rocking chair from a block up from an old folks' home. And he stood down there, and that's as far as he opened the window. Nothing on the counter or anything was disturbed. So we knew at that point, my partner and I knew that we were dealing with somebody agile and probably young. And we felt like he'd already gained entry to the house before she got home. But you kind of taken, you know, I can honestly say in all the homicides, I was in County Police Department in 1971, and I made detective and went right to homicide. We only had 4 homicide detectives. And at that point, I had probably worked 50 to 75 homicides. And I knew when I walked in the bedroom that we were in trouble. I told Lynn, my partner, I said, this is scary, this is unusual. But we processed the scene for 5 days, recovered 1 hair rather than the sheet. No fingerprints, no nothing.
No witnesses.
No witnesses. He was just so quiet. I mean, the apartment's back to back. But he never made any noise. And we figured that he probably wore a mask and a jumpsuit. For a reason I'll tell you what, we got a call at 4216 Forest Hill Avenue. When the car had been running all night. I got home at 2 o'clock and the little Renault was running in front of me, so we ran to check on it. And they say it was leading back to David Davis. But during one of the interviews with the suspect, I asked him, could he straight drive the transmission? No. Well, see, Forest Hill Avenue is a straight thoroughfare all the way through South Side, where most of the police come through that. And we feel like that he left, took the car, and couldn't shift gears. So he left it abandoned, and it ran from 2 o'clock till 10 o'clock when the officer found it.
We know that the last person or the last people that Debbie talked to were her parents. She spoke to them from roughly 8:30 p.m. that Friday evening to around 9:30 p.m. Debbie needed to get her appendix out soon. She was having some medical issues and was talking with her parents about coming back home to the Lynchburg area where she was from so they could take care of her while she would get surgery. That was the last time her parents spoke with her. Ray, while Debbie was having this conversation with her parents, where was the South Side Strangler?
He lived at 1800 block of Bainbridge Street at a...
no, during the conversation, when she was on the phone.
We feel like he was in the closet. Because when she came out of her bedroom, apparently she had glasses on and a toothbrush. So we think he was in the closet across the hallway, came out and he grabbed her and glasses came off and the toothbrush. And he put duct tape over her mouth. And then he changed it different. He always carried a kit. It's called a murder kit. But we never found a murder kit. They also take souvenirs. Never found a souvenir. But we knew that we were in trouble with this. You know, you run-of-the-mill homicide, we knew it wouldn't be that.
And Lorna, what was it like at Style afterward?
Well, it's hard to describe. we spent the weekend calling everyone and going, lots of us lived in Fannin, so there was a lot of walking and congregating and hugging and crying and all of that. And I remember Monday morning we got Ben Campbell, who's now Richmond, who was with St. Paul's at the time, to come and did a session for us and gathered us all together and talked about Debbie. And people were just deeply sad and upset. And at the time, we knew our friend had been killed. We knew none of the details. We didn't know about South Side Strangler. We didn't know that this was a serial killer. We just really were focused on the loss of this dear friend. 2 weeks later, and those 2 weeks were disturbing and upsetting, and police people all over the place and all that. 2 weeks later, when Dr. Helms was murdered, we knew that it wasn't particularly about style or me or anyone else in the office, but the fear then escalated. So we were also in this odd position of covering it as well, and had some people, lots of people working on that and trying to figure out how to cover it, how to do it, how to be part of the story, not be part of the story. I had lots of details that I wasn't in any way privileged to report or share. I didn't necessarily want to. But that began the beginning of this huge fear around the city, this sort of paralyzed sense of particularly women trying to protect themselves and being frightened to go out alone, and being, the television programs would do these little stories about women, if you're afraid, now your window is shut. And there was that whole sort of mentality of fear.
And it went on for months.
And it went on for a long time.
Ray, Lorna brought up Dr. Helms. So 2 weeks after Debbie Davis.
Saturday.
Yeah, 2 weeks later, Dr. Helms' murder is called in. And you go in, you see a virtually identical MO. What did you say to your partner, Glenn?
I told Glenn, I said, we go through with that. Same son of a bitch who killed Debbie Davis.
And you knew at that point.
We knew at that point. And same MO, but he cut a screen upstairs and crawled in. It's probably in her closet when she got home. She had one of 2 friends. She was wearing a red dress and a double-tie belt. He put both belts around her neck and stood on her back and pulled them. And she'd run herself unconscious. He'd wait till she came back. He'd rape her. And then he'd leave pure semen samples all over the room.
Hence the DNA.
Yes.
All right, so on that note, before we play our new extended trailer for Southern Nightmare, we have just a couple of minutes. We're actually running a little late tonight. Does anybody in the audience want to ask any questions for me or for any of our guests tonight? If you do, please come forward. We've got a microphone here. Anybody? Okay, that works. We're good. People want to come up.
Yeah, I have a question
Okay.
for Ray that I'd like clarified on Dr. Helms. I'd like clarification on Dr. Helms. I understand that she had been out to eat that night someplace on Broad Street.
Yes.
And when she came home, was she alone or were her friends still with her?
2 friends came in. They went back to the kitchen.
So they came,
Yeah, they came. They walked her inside and then they left.
and he was there at the time.
Yeah, she went upstairs and took her jewelry off, laid it on the counter and everything, because she was going to take a shower, I guess. But what he did, we feel like when her husband got home, we think he was still in the house, because he hurriedly moved her body and shoved the body parcel away into the closet. When he comes in, didn't even notice her. He goes to the closet, goes to take a shower, comes back, and he looked on the bed, and there was spots of blood all over the bed, and he turned and saw her lying on the floor. Oh, it's a tough sight in the closet.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Anybody else? Oh, okay.
Can we put the lights up so we can see the faces?
Sorry.
We can't see who's talking.
Oh, Mayor, can you raise the house lights? We were trying to protect our identities, would you believe that? Okay, so, is there a question or just want the lights up? Okay, just want the lights on. All right, anybody else? Going once, going twice, 3 times?
I'd like to make another comment too. Back when I first went on the police department, police officers were very possessive of their cases. So they end up hiding stuff from other jurisdictions. Well, after Debbie Davis's death and Susan Helen was killed, we organized a task force with 46 police officers. We organized, and once we developed the suspect, he was followed for 19 days before we finally made the arrest. And from the time we submitted the samples to Life Codes in New York for the DNA, it took 12 weeks to get the first one sent back to us.
Okay, we got another question here.
Well, I'll probably wait for the podcast when you get the real information, but how long was the killing spree, from what date to what dates?
It depends on how you, yeah, because there was a break. There was a break in, let's not get into that tonight though. How long did the killing spree go on? I would say the 1987 one went on for about 3-4 months. About,
Yes,
yeah.
I worked on, that's the only case I worked on for 18 months. We tried him on all 5 homicides because DNA had never been tried before. The first case we tried him on, it took a 9-day DNA trial just for the jury to hear the experts from Life Codes. That's all it did for 9 days to go over what DNA was.
Okay, we got another question.
Were there any connections between the women and were they random?
Well, what we think he went to.
Were they random,
Well,
the women?
can we,
Okay.
we'll get into it. We'll tell you how. We'll tell you how on the podcast. We'll get there. We'll get there. We're not going to give away